The mysterious case of the oceans. We have the same questions with the oceans that we had with Antarctica, which are, who owns them? Who can operate there? And what are they allowed to do? These are actually ancient questions and concerns. What can you think of, besides recreation, that the seas, the oceans, the waterways of the world are used for by a state? Go ahead and think about it. Okay, commerce and transport for sure. Resources like fishing and farming, and not just fish farming, but in addition to that, kelp farming and seaweed farming. Water and salt, oil and mineral extraction, military activities, and dumping. Now you might say to yourself, why does this matter to me? I'll tell you why. What you have a picture there on the left-hand side of is the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. You can see the breakwater that protects those ports. And on the right-hand side is the port of Los Angeles and all of these cargo containers being offloaded there. You almost certainly have on your person at this moment something that came in as a result of international oceanic traffic and shipping into one of those two ports. That's why it's important. It makes gazillions of dollars and employs gazillions of people. At one point in my life, I was on Rapa Nui, which is also known as Isla de Pascua, which is also known as Easter Island, and I was at Anakena Beach, which you can see where the waves are crashing right behind the Moai there. And then out in the distance, you can see a ship that came in from Tahiti. And I was standing in the water at the beach, about up to my waist, more or less, talking to a Rapa Nui woman, a Polynesian woman. And I said, how did the ancient Polynesians ever find this place, this speck of land, out isolated in the South Pacific? And she said, you are looking at the ocean completely the wrong way. They didn't see it as something that impeded movement. They saw the ocean as something that facilitated movement. They saw the ocean as an information and oceanic superhighway. They went thousands of miles north of Tahiti to one of the most isolated places in the world, the Hawaiian Islands. They didn't even know they were there. There's pretty good evidence that they also got to the west coast of the Americas. And of course, they got to Rapa Nui. And the way they did this was on double-hulled catamarans, like what you see on the left-hand side. Now, people have been on the water for tens of thousands of years. We know that the indigenous peoples of the Americas used canoes, like you see on the top right-hand side. And of course, the ancient people of Egypt used papyrus reed ships, like what you see down on the bottom right-hand side. The Chinese were great mariners. On the left-hand side is a Chinese commercial vessel, sometimes referred to as a junk. And then on the right-hand side is a Chinese military vessel, which you can see could move quickly when there was no wind because they also had oars. The Romans had the same types of ships. And of course, the Romans put these metal things on the front so they could ram other military vessels. And then the Europeans in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s began to develop these tall-masted ships that had these big sails that they used both for military conquest and at the same time for commercial activity. Now we have these massive ships with all of these cargo containers on them for commercial activity. And keep in mind that every one of those cargo containers is the size of a truck. And we have these massive military vessels. Of course, we know about the Europeans because it's recent, particularly the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, and the French. But the Chinese were great mariners. The Arabs were great mariners. The Egyptians were great mariners. And of course, we know the Polynesians were as well. But European conquest, beginning in the 15th century, that's the 1400s, set up a system of trade, commerce, and oceanic spheres of influence that still exists today. You've probably heard of the Treaty of Tordesillas. If you've had my world regional class, you definitely have, which happened in 1494. Remember, in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. He sailed for Spain. And at the time, the Spanish and the Portuguese were the two European powerhouses. They were both Catholic countries, and they were both competitors. And they wanted to split the world up. So what did they do? They went to the Pope. The Pope comes up with the Treaty of Tordesillas without any real information to do this, and the Pope's line, which is going to split the world into Spanish and Portuguese influenced areas. You can see right here the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is at 46 degrees, 37 minutes west longitude. You know, the original Pope line was here in 1493, but this becomes the line in 1494. And everything to the west of it, where the red arrow's at, was Spanish influence. everything to the east of it, where the yellow arrow was at, was going to be Portuguese influenced. And then in 1529, they come up with the Treaty of Sarakosa, which further splits the world up. You'd see the purple arrow is pointing at this line of demarcation, sorry about that, which is the Treaty of Sarakosa. And then this line right here that is being pointed out by the green arrow, that line of demarcation is the Treaty of Tordesillas. Everything between them was going to be Portuguese influence. Everything outside of them was going to be Spanish influence. If you think about it for a second, it's almost laughable that they would do this, but it is also the height of arrogance, isn't it? In the 16th through the 19th centuries, the Europeans spread their influence through their languages, their religions, their politics, their economics, their ideas, and their power around the world using the ocean. This was primarily done by the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Dutch, which is the Netherlands, the Germans, the Belgians, and the Italians. Because there was interactions between them, and competition between them, and commerce, over time, really beginning thousands of years ago, but over time, there began to be a general laws of the sea, which means how you operated on the open seas. But that, of course, brings up the question, how far out to sea did your country's territory extend? Think about it. Where does your country's territory end? Does it end right at the shoreline where the land and water come together? Does it stretch out 1 mile, 5 miles, 500 miles? How far out does it go, and how far out of it is yours? How far out are you, the person who operates and controls that area? This is what's known as your territorial sea or your territorial waters. In the 1590s, Denmark declared that its territory would extend 8 miles offshore. And then they quickly stretched that to 24 miles offshore. There were two things kind of going on here. First of all, when I say miles, I'm talking about nautical miles. 1 nautical mile equals 1.15 statute or land miles. Like if you're driving your car and it says something is 5 miles away, those are statute miles. 1 nautical mile is really 1 minute of latitude. You don't need to know that, but I'm just telling you. 1 nautical mile is a little bit bigger than 1 statute mile. It's 1.15 miles. And the other thing is this. At first, this stretching out the territory into the water had to do with fishing rights because the North Atlantic was fertile fishing grounds, and all of the countries along the North Atlantic were big fishing countries. The British then wanted what they called closed seas with equal width offshore to be territorial waters. Closed seas meant it was theirs to operate in, and equal width meant this, that every place from their coastline stretching out, let's say 10 miles, was theirs. No matter what the coastline looked like, go straight out 10 miles, and that was going to be theirs, equal width away from the coastline. Now, at the same time, other countries could use the water in the closed seas for fishing or transport, but only with permission. The Dutch, that means the Netherlands, wanted open seas for the sake of commerce, because the Dutch don't have a lot of coastline. Now, you probably heard of Rembrandt and Van Dyck and Vermeer. The reason you've heard of them is because the Dutch in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s became extremely wealthy through oceanic commerce. This is why they wanted open seas. But other European countries also wanted the equal width idea applied to their countries. The issue became how far out is going to be yours. Around 1800, a 3-mile limit was agreed upon, but that was slowly pushed out farther. And mostly these things were accepted, as in the 3-mile limit or 4-mile or 10-mile, but they're only loosely applied and enforced. Then World War I came along. World War I happens from 1914 to 1918, and that basically destroyed the 19th century world and the 19th century way of thinking. Interest in the seas changed as a result of World War I from strictly commerce and security to the resources that were in the planet's waters. And attempts were made toward official agreements about oceanic operations. And in September 1945, World War II ends in August of 1945, President Harry S. Truman of the United States makes the Truman Proclamation. And the Truman Proclamation says this: the U.S. would regulate fishing on the high seas, I'll come back to that term shortly, contiguous, that means next to, the U.S. territory, while allowing navigation. So we would regulate the fishing, but we would allow navigation on the high seas. And importantly, the U.S. would have jurisdiction over all resources on its territorial continental shelf, which could extend down to about 660 feet in depth. Why would he include that last part? Because of oil. Along our coastline, we began to discover quite a lot of oil. 1 month after the Truman Proclamation, Mexico declared the same thing. Why? Because of oil. And that was followed rapidly by a lot of other countries. By the 1970s, many countries in Latin America and Africa began to demand a 200-mile offshore economic zone with exclusive rights. Again, this had to do with offshore drilling for oil. Where are we today? Well, in 1982, the Third United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is UNCLOS, UNCLOS, set the most broadly adopted definitions of territorial waters. A full sovereignty is granted to the first 12 nautical miles from the shore. That means that's completely yours. Beyond that are international waters, but there's a contiguous zone that extends another 12 nautical miles. So now we're talking 24 nautical miles offshore, and you administer that area. And there is an exclusive economic zone, EEZ, that extends another 200 nautical miles beyond the full sovereignty zone. It's a hard word to say and to spell. Sorry about that, which means 212 nautical miles out. You have the exclusive rights to manage, explore, and exploit that area. The high seas is the area beyond those 200 nautical miles. So 212 nautical miles offshore, you hit high seas, which is open sea. If you look at this diagram, you can see that this is the continental shelf. And in the case of the United States on the East Coast, this extends out a couple hundred miles, even more than that. And so you can see this is why Truman wanted to grab all of that area there. So these are complicated, but if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the Territorial Sea, which is the first 12 nautical miles, then the contiguous zone, which goes out to 24 nautical miles in totality, and then the exclusive economic zone, and beyond that, the high seas. Down at the bottom, you can see this is sovereign territory at first, and then sovereign rights to the water column and the continental shelf, and then sovereign rights to the continental shelf in case there's anything in here in the rocks. You can see this is a top view. Here's the land. Same thing. This is the Territorial Sea right here. And then you can see the contiguous zone. And you can see right here the exclusive economic zone. And then all of this is international waters. Once you go beyond that first 12 nautical miles, you are in international waters. And then you can see these are the exclusive economic zones surrounding the continents in the light blue. This is in the Pacific Ocean. You can see a lot of that is spoken for. There's a lot of small countries out there. The 12-mile limit is broadly accepted as sovereign by almost everyone. States must allow peaceful, non-hostile passage of foreign vessels, including military vessels, though. Submarines are supposed to navigate on the surface and fly their flag as they pass through that area. And aircraft do not have the rights to cross territorial waters without permission. So what about inland waterways like the St. Lawrence River or Seaway, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River? Well, all waters like rivers, seas, lakes, and bays that are within the land side of the shoreline of a state are considered internal waters and are restricted according to discretion of the country. So, for example, anybody can't just sail at the Mississippi. Straits like the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Gibraltar, well, those have territorial restrictions based on the neighboring states, but they generally allow movement. And then the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal are internal waterways, but they also generally allow movement. They kind of operate like straits in a way. So if you look here, you can see the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman are at. Then you can see the Strait of Malacca. You can see all the ships in it, where Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia are at. Now you can see the Strait of Gibraltar in between Spain and Morocco. Now this shows international shipping. Look at all of that. And then look right here, the Strait of Hormuz, oil comes out of there. Gibraltar, what happens is all of the stuff that's coming up and out of Europe and into Europe goes through there. And then the Strait of Malacca is the main east-west thoroughfare between Africa, the Strait of Hormuz and the oil, and East Asia.